If you hear the wrong note once, you can ignore it. But if you feel it, you can never unhear it. That was what my old vocal coach used to say, and standing there under a $20,000 chandelier, balancing a tray of crystal glasses I could never afford to replace, I felt it before anyone else did. The orchestra slipping just half a beat behind the soprano. The kind of mistake only someone who had spent years training their ear would notice, and I hated that I noticed, because this wasn't my world anymore. Not the velvet curtains, or the polished marble floors, or the music that used to feel like oxygen. This was just a job. 8 hours on my feet for $18 an hour plus tips if I was lucky. Smile, serve, disappear. That was the rule, and I followed it. Until I didn't, because my fingers tapped once against the tray, a soft correction, barely audible, but it felt louder in my chest, like a memory trying to wake up, and that was when I felt it. Not the music, not the mistake, but his eyes, watching me instead of the stage, and I didn't have to look to know who it was. Everyone in that room had already adjusted themselves when he walked in, voices lowered, shoulders straightened, conversations softened into something careful, like the air itself didn't want to offend him. Sebastian Rossi didn't need an introduction. Power announced itself without words, and somehow, for reasons I didn't understand, that power was focused on me, just a waitress in a borrowed uniform that didn't quite fit right. I kept my eyes down, because that's what you do when someone like him notices you. You disappear, you become invisible again. But the music stumbled a second time, sharper now, impossible to ignore, and before I could stop myself, I shook my head, just a fraction, just enough to release the frustration sitting in my chest, and that was the mistake, because the next thing I heard wasn't the orchestra. It was his voice, low, smooth, cutting through the room without ever rising. Then you do it. And the words didn't make sense at first, not to me, not to anyone. A ripple of confused laughter moving through the guests like a passing breeze, but he didn't laugh, and when I finally looked up, I realized he wasn't joking, his gaze steady, almost curious, like he had just discovered something unexpected. If you can sing this aria, he added, the corner of his mouth lifting into something that wasn't quite a smile, I'll marry you. And just like that, the room changed, laughter sharper now, directed, dismissive, people leaning in to whisper, to watch, to enjoy the spectacle of a waitress being put in her place. Because that's what this was supposed to be, a game, a reminder of where I stood and where I didn't belong. I felt the heat rise to my face, the weight of 100 eyes pressing against me, telling me to step back, to apologize, to disappear like I was supposed to. And for a second, I almost did, my grip tightening on the tray, my body ready to retreat into the safety of invisibility. But then the orchestra reset, the conductor lifting his baton again, and I heard it, the opening note, clean, perfect, the way it used to be when I stood on a stage instead of the edge of someone else's world, and something inside me shifted, quiet but irreversible, because I realized it wasn't just the music I couldn't ignore, it was him, watching, waiting, not for me to fail, but for me to decide. And that was the most dangerous part, because no one had asked me to decide anything in a long time. I set the tray down before I could change my mind. The soft clink of glass louder than it should have been in the silence that followed. And when I stepped forward, just one step, it felt like crossing a line I wouldn't be able to step back from, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. But he didn't look away, didn't smirk, didn't move. He just watched, like the entire room had disappeared, and it was only me left to prove something I hadn't even meant to reveal. And when I finally opened my mouth, drawing in a breath that tasted like fear and memory and something dangerously close to hope, I realized this wasn't about the aria anymore, and maybe it never was. I did not start loud. I did not start perfect. I started honest, and that was enough to make the room go still. The first note left my throat softer than it should have been, trembling at the edges, like it was not sure it belonged here any more than I did. But I did not stop, because stopping would mean going back, and I knew I could not go back after stepping forward like this. The orchestra hesitated, confused, the conductor's hand frozen midair, as if he was deciding whether to follow me or shut me down. And for a heartbeat, everything hung there, fragile, uncertain, until something shifted, not in them, but in me, because I remembered what it felt like to trust my own voice, not the room, not the people watching, Not the man standing 10 feet away with the kind of power that could rewrite lives with a sentence. Just the music, just the breath, just the sound moving through me like it had been waiting all this time to be let out again. And when the next phrase came, it came stronger, fuller, not perfect but real, the kind of real that does not ask for permission. And that was when the conductor lowered his hand. Just slightly, just enough. And the orchestra followed me, not the other way around. The correction subtle but undeniable, the harmony settling into place like something that had always been meant to sound this way. And I felt it in my chest, that alignment, that rightness. And it scared me more than the silence had, because it meant I had not lost it, not completely, not even after everything. The room was quiet now, no whispers, no laughter, just attention, heavy and focused, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me. But I did not look at them, I looked past them, through them, to a place that only existed when I sang. A place where I was not just someone carrying trays and counting tips at the end of a shift, a place where I had once been someone else entirely, someone with a future that had sounded a lot like this. And then I made the mistake of looking at him, because I needed to know if he was still smirking, if this was still a game to him. But he was not smiling anymore, not even close. His expression had changed into something I could not immediately name, something sharper, more focused, like he was listening in a way that went beyond the music, like he was trying to understand me. And that realization hit harder than any laughter could have, because it meant this was no longer entertainment. It was something else, something I had not agreed to but had stepped into anyway. My voice climbed, the aria reaching the part that used to terrify me, the part that demanded control and surrender at the same time. And for a split second doubt flickered, old and familiar. The memory of a stage light too bright, a mistake too public, a moment that had changed everything, and my breath caught, just slightly, just enough that I felt the edge of falling again. But then I heard it, not from the orchestra, not from the room, but from him, not words, just a quiet, steady presence, like he was not expecting perfection, just courage, and that was enough. I steadied. I finished the phrase, not flawlessly but fully. And when the final note left me, it lingered in the air longer than it should have, like even the sound was reluctant to disappear. And then there was silence, not the awkward kind, not the polite kind, but the kind that means something has shifted and no one knows what comes next. I stood there, chest rising, hands slightly shaking, aware again of where I was, of the uniform, of the people, of the line I had crossed. And for a moment I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Because this world did not reward people like me for stepping out of place. It corrected them, quietly, efficiently, but then he moved, just one step forward, and the entire room seemed to breathe again. Conversations did not resume, no one laughed, no one clapped, they just watched, waiting, the way people do when they know something important is about to happen, and he stopped close enough that I could see the exact moment his gaze softened, not much, just enough to make it human. "You did not sing it better," he said, his voice low, measured. And for a second my stomach dropped, the words hitting like a quiet rejection, like everything I had just risked had not been enough. But then he tilted his head slightly, studying me like he had already decided something and was just letting me catch up to it. "You sang it honestly," he continued, and the way he said it made the difference feel larger than any compliment I had ever received. My throat tightened, not from the performance, but from the weight of being seen in a way I had not been prepared for. And before I could respond, before I could retreat or deflect or pretend this had not just changed something fundamental, he added, softer now, almost like it was meant only for me. And that makes it dangerous. And I did not know if he meant the music, or me, or what would happen next. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that whatever line I had just crossed, there was no stepping back over it. People think silence is empty, but it is not. It is full of decisions waiting to be made. And in that moment, every single person in that room was waiting for his, not mine. Not the girl who had just stepped out of line and somehow rewritten the rules for 60 seconds, but the man who controlled what happened next. Sebastian Rossi did not rush. He never rushed. That was the first thing I understood about him. Power did not move quickly. It moved precisely. And when he lifted his hand, just slightly, the tension shifted, not broken, just redirected, like the entire room had been holding its breath and now did not know how to exhale. "What is your name?" he asked. And it should have been a simple question. It should have felt normal, but nothing about this felt normal anymore. Not the way he was looking at me, not the way no one else dared to interrupt, not the way my own voice felt different in my throat, like it had woken something I could not put back to sleep. "Emily," I said. And I almost added Carter, almost gave him the full version of me the way people always ask for. But something stopped me, something quiet and instinctive, because names had weight, and I had already given him more than I intended tonight. "Emily," he repeated, slower, like he was testing how it fit, and then he nodded once, a small motion that somehow carried more finality than applause ever could. "You work here," he said, not as a question, but as a fact, and I nodded, because that part was still true, still safe, still something I could hold on to, for now. He added, and that was when the ground shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because those two words carried an assumption I had not agreed to, an implication that my life was already in motion towards something else, something I had not chosen. "I am just a waitress," I said, and I meant it as a boundary, a reminder, maybe even a warning. But the way his expression changed told me he heard something different, not limitation, not apology, but defiance, quiet and steady. The kind that does not announce itself but does not back down either. "No," he said, almost gently. "You are not just anything." And the simplicity of it made my chest tighten in a way I did not expect, because it had been a long time since anyone had corrected me like that. Not to diminish, but to elevate, and I did not know what to do with that. Around us, the room began to shift back into motion, carefully, like people were unsure what version of reality they were allowed to return to. Conversations started again in low voices, glasses clinked, the orchestra adjusted their instruments. But the energy was different now, charged, aware, like everyone knew something had happened even if they could not name it. And I was suddenly very aware of where I stood, in the center of a space that was never meant for me, with every instinct telling me to step back, to return to the safety of invisibility before this turned into something I could not control. "I should get back to work," I said, because that was the only sentence that made sense, the only way to reattach myself to something familiar. But he did not move, did not step aside, did not make it easy. "You think this is work?" he asked, and there was no mockery in his voice, just curiosity, like he genuinely wanted to understand how I saw the world I was standing in. "It pays my rent," I said, and that felt like the most honest answer I could give, measured in dollars and hours and survival, something concrete. Something real, something far away from opera stages and impossible promises. He studied me for a moment, longer than was comfortable, longer than was necessary, like he was measuring something I could not see. And then he did something I did not expect. He stepped back, just enough to give me space, just enough to let me choose what happened next. And that, more than anything else, unsettled me, because control I understood, pressure I understood, but space meant I had to decide. And I was not sure I trusted my own decisions anymore. Not after tonight. Not after the way everything had shifted with a single note. I reached for the tray, my hand steadier now, but not calm, not completely. And as I turned to leave, I felt his gaze follow me, not possessive, not demanding, just present, like a thread I could not see but could still feel. And I told myself I imagined it, told myself it would fade the moment I stepped back into the rhythm of work, orders, tables, tips, the small predictable world I knew how to navigate. But as I moved through the crowd, picking up glasses, answering polite requests, smiling in all the right places, nothing felt the same, every sound sharper, every movement more deliberate, like I had been slightly out of tune before and now I could hear it. And then, just as I started to believe I could disappear again, that I could fold this moment into something manageable, something forgettable, I heard his voice behind me, quiet but unmistakable. "Emily." And I stopped, because of course I did, because some things you do not ignore once you have heard them. And when I turned back, he was closer than I expected, close enough that the rest of the room blurred at the edges. "I do not make offers lightly," he said, and there was no trace of humor left in his expression now, no smirk, no game, just certainty, the kind that does not need to be raised to be heard. And I do not repeat them. And the weight of those words settled between us, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. And I realized, with a clarity that made my pulse slow instead of race, that this was not about the aria anymore, not even about the performance. It was about what came after, about what he believed I had just proven, and what he intended to do with that. And for the first time that night, I understood that the most dangerous part was not that he had noticed me. It was that he had decided not to forget. I should have walked away. That was the simplest truth in a room full of complicated ones. I should have nodded politely, returned to the quiet rhythm of trays and tables, let his words dissolve into something I could pretend never happened. But instead I stood there, caught in the space between who I had been an hour ago and who I had just revealed myself to be. And for the first time that night, I chose not to lower my eyes. Then maybe you should not make offers to strangers, I said. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it. Not fear, not exactly, but the awareness that I had just stepped further into something I did not understand, because people did not speak to him like that. I could feel it in the way the air shifted again, subtle but sharp, conversations dimming just enough, attention tilting back toward us without anyone appearing obvious about it. But he did not react the way I expected. He did not get offended, did not dismiss me, did not correct me. Instead, something in his expression changed again, not softer, not harder, just interested, like I had just confirmed something he had already suspected. You are not a stranger, he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost private, even though we stood in the middle of a crowded room. Not anymore. And those two words carried a weight that settled deeper than the earlier ones, because they suggested a shift that I had not agreed to but could not deny, something about being seen, truly seen, that erased the distance I had been trying to keep. You do not know anything about me, I replied, because I needed to say it, needed to hold on to something that still belonged to me, something unobserved, unclaimed, untouched by whatever world he operated in. But he tilted his head slightly, considering, like he was deciding how much truth to give me in return. I know enough, he said, and that should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it made my pulse slow, not from comfort, but from focus, because if there was one thing I understood, it was the difference between assumption and certainty, and he spoke like someone who dealt only in the second. You heard the mistake before. Anyone else, he continued. You corrected it without thinking, and you did not back down when the room laughed. Each observation landed with quiet precision, not exaggerated, not romanticized, just stated, like facts being recorded, and I realized he was not impressed by the performance. Not really. He was interested in the choice behind it, the moment I could have stepped away and did not. And that realization unsettled me in a way I could not easily explain, because it meant this was not about talent. It was about something deeper, something harder to hide. That does not mean anything, I said, but the words felt weaker than I intended, like even I did not fully believe them. And he noticed, of course he did. People like him always notice the difference between what was said and what was meant. It means everything, he said simply, and there was no argument in his tone, no need to convince, just certainty. And I hated how that certainty made me question my own, because I had spent years telling myself that part of my life was over, that it did not matter anymore, that it was safer to forget than to remember. And yet here I was, standing in a room I did not belong in, being reminded that I had never actually lost it. I had just buried it, and he had somehow found the exact place to dig. I am not interested in your world, I said, because that felt like the only defense I had left, to draw a line before he could erase it, to define the boundary before he could step across it. And for a moment, just a brief one, something unreadable passed through his eyes, not disappointment, not frustration, something closer to recognition, like he had expected that answer and was simply waiting to see how I would say it. You are already in it, he replied, and the calm in his voice made the statement land heavier than anything louder could have, because it did not sound like a warning, it sounded like a fact, and facts were harder to argue with, harder to escape. I shook my head, more to steady myself than to disagree, because if I let that idea take hold, even for a second, it would change everything. I sang one song, I said, grounding myself in something measurable, something finite. That does not change my life. And for the first time since he had spoken to me, he smiled, not the earlier smirk, not something amused or distant, but something smaller, sharper, like he knew something I did not. No, he said. The song did not. And then he stepped closer, just enough to close the space I had been trying to maintain, just enough to make the world narrow again to the space between us. You did. And the way he said it made the distinction feel absolute, like the moment I had stepped forward had already set something in motion that could not be undone. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to push back against the inevitability in his tone, but the words did not come, because somewhere beneath the resistance, beneath the fear, beneath the instinct to retreat, there was something else, something quieter but more persistent, the recognition that he might be right. And that was the most dangerous thought of all, because if he was right, then walking away would not undo anything. It would only delay what came next, and I did not know if I was ready for what came next, but I knew, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that whatever it was, he had already decided I was part of it. There is a moment when everything could still go back to normal, and you feel it slipping away in real time, like sand through your fingers, and I knew I was standing in that exact moment. Because all I had to do was step back, pick up my tray, smile like nothing had happened, and this night would become just another story I never told. But instead I stayed, and that was the problem, because staying meant choosing. And choosing meant consequences. You are assuming too much, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Because if I let even a fraction of his certainty become mine, I would lose whatever control I still had. And control was the only thing keeping me grounded right now. But he did not argue. He did not push. He just watched me the way someone watches a door they already know will open, patient, certain, and that kind of patience was more unsettling than pressure, because it meant he was not worried about the outcome, only about when it would happen. Tell me something, Emily, he said, and there was a shift in his tone, subtle but deliberate, like he had moved from observing to testing. If this does not matter, then why did you not walk away? And the question landed exactly where he intended it to, because I did not have a clean answer, not one that sounded as simple as I wanted it to be. I could have said pride. I could have said impulse. I could have said nothing at all, but none of those felt honest enough. And he would know. He would hear the difference the same way I heard the wrong note in the music, so I held his gaze instead, longer than I should have, and said the only thing that felt real. Because I remembered. And there it was. The truth I had been avoiding all night, simple and dangerous, because memory was not just about the past. It was about what you chose to carry forward, and I had just admitted I was still carrying it. His expression did not change immediately, but something in his eyes sharpened, like that answer had confirmed something important, something he had been waiting to hear. Good, he said, and the word should not have meant anything, but the way he said it made it feel like approval. Like I had passed a test I did not know I was taking, and I did not like how that made my chest tighten, how it made me want to understand what came next. Because wanting to understand him felt like stepping further into a world I had already decided I did not belong in. That does not mean I am staying, I added quickly, because I needed to reclaim something, anything, before this conversation became something I could not walk away from. And for a brief second, just a flicker, I thought I saw amusement in his expression again, not mocking, not dismissive, just aware. You are already staying, he said, and he did not mean physically. I knew that immediately. He meant the part of me that had stepped forward and refused to step back, the part that had answered him. Instead of ignoring him, the part that was still standing here instead of disappearing into the crowd, and I hated how accurate that felt, how it stripped away the illusion that I still had full control over this situation. Because control is easy when nothing is at stake. But tonight something had shifted, and I was no longer sure what I was protecting or from whom. Around us, the event continued, but it felt distant now, like background noise to something much more immediate. The music resumed, conversations picked up, but none of it reached me the same way, because my focus had narrowed to the space between us, to the quiet tension that had nothing to do with the performance anymore and everything to do with what came after it. I have responsibilities, I said, and that felt important, not as an excuse, but as a reminder, to him and to myself, that my life existed outside of this moment, outside of this room, measured in rent payments and early shifts in practical decisions. So do I, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer made it harder to dismiss, because it placed us on a level I was not prepared to accept, not equal, not the same, but parallel in a way that suggested he understood more than I expected him to. Then you understand why I cannot just. I stopped, because I did not know how to finish that sentence without admitting something I was not ready to admit, and he did not help me, did not fill the silence, did not make it easier. He just waited, and that waiting felt deliberate, like he was giving me space to say something that mattered, something that would define what happened next, but I was not ready to define it. Not yet, so I shook my head slightly, breaking the moment before it could settle into something permanent. This was just a song, I said, even though we both knew it was more than that. And he let the statement hang there for a second, long enough for me to hear how incomplete it sounded, before he stepped back again, creating that same space as before, the kind that forces you to confront your own choices instead of reacting to someone else's. Then we will start with that, he said, and there was something in his tone that made the words feel like the beginning of something rather than the end, one song. And the way he said it carried a quiet promise, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like he was not asking for more. He was simply stating that more would come, and for the first time that night, I realized that the real question was not whether I would step into his world. It was whether I could step away now that I knew exactly where the door was. And as I picked up the tray again, as I turned back toward the life I understood, I felt it, that pull, not physical, not forceful, just present, like a note still echoing long after the music had stopped, and I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that this was not the last time I would hear it. The rest of the night should have felt ordinary, but nothing returned to ordinary once you hear yourself differently. Once you realize the version of you that you buried is still very much alive. I moved through the room the way I always did, measured steps, quiet smile, polite nods, but every movement felt slightly out of sync, like I was playing a role I had memorized but no longer believed in. Every glass I set down, every order I took, every thank you I repeated felt thinner than it had an hour ago, like the meaning had drained out of it, and I knew exactly why, because somewhere behind me, without even looking, I could feel it, his presence, not loud, not demanding, just constant, like a note sustained in the background of everything else. And the worst part was not that he was watching, it was that I was aware of it, that I was adjusting to it, that a part of me was waiting for it, which made no sense, which should not have made sense, because my life did not include men. Like him, my life included early alarms, rent due dates, and the quiet discipline of surviving 1 week at a time. Not this, not whatever this was becoming. Emily, my manager's voice cut through my thoughts, sharper than usual, and I turned quickly, grateful for something concrete to focus on. Table 12 needs attention, now, he said, and there was something in his tone, not anger, not exactly, but urgency mixed with caution, and I followed his glance without meaning to, straight to the center of the room, straight to him, and for a second my chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, because of course it was his table, of course it would come back to him, like everything tonight had been quietly circling the same point. I will handle it, I said, before my manager could add anything else, before I could second-guess myself. And as I reached for the tray, I realized my hands were steady, not calm, not relaxed, but steady in the way they used to be before stepping on stage, controlled, focused, aware of every movement, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant I was not just reacting anymore. I was choosing to step back into his orbit. I approached the table slowly, aware of the shift in attention as I got closer, the subtle quiet that followed me like a shadow. His associates were speaking in low voices, polished, composed, but they stopped when I arrived, not out of courtesy, but out of awareness, because he had already noticed me. Of course he had. He did not look up immediately, which somehow made it worse, made the moment stretch longer than necessary, until finally, without urgency, without hesitation, he lifted his gaze, and there it was again, that same focus, that same intensity, like nothing else in the room held his interest in quite the same way. "You came back," he said, and it was not a question, just an observation, but it carried something underneath it, something that sounded dangerously close to satisfaction, and I resisted the instinct to react to it, to let it define the moment. "I am working," I replied, placing a glass carefully in front of him, keeping my movements precise, controlled, Because if I let even a fraction of what I was feeling show, I was not sure I would be able to take it back. Of course you are, he said, and the faintest trace of that earlier amusement returned. But it was different now. Less about control, more about recognition. Like he understood exactly what I was trying to do and was choosing not to interfere, which somehow made it harder, not easier. I moved to step away, to continue the cycle, to re-establish the distance I needed, but his next words stopped me before I could take a full step. Sit, he said, and the word was quiet, almost casual, but it landed with the weight of something much larger, because it was not just a suggestion, it was a shift, a redefinition of roles that I had not agreed to, and I felt the instinct to refuse rise immediately, sharp and clear, because that was the line, that was where I drew it. But then I noticed something I had not seen before, the empty chair beside him, untouched, waiting, not as a trap, not as a command, but as an invitation. And that difference mattered more than I wanted it to, because invitations can be declined, but they also require a decision, and decisions were exactly what I had been avoiding all night. I cannot, I said, but my voice was softer now, not uncertain, just aware of the eyes on us, aware of the shift this would create, aware of the fact that once I sat down, nothing would feel the same again. You can, he replied, just as quietly, and there was no pressure in his tone, no force, just certainty, the kind that did not push, it waited, and I realized, standing there between the table and the rest of my life, that this was no longer about him asking. It was about me choosing whether to step further into something I did not understand or retreat into something that no longer felt completely mine. And for a long second, I did nothing, just stood there, caught between two versions of myself, until finally, slowly, deliberately, I placed the tray down, and the sound it made against the table felt louder than it should have, like a quiet decision echoing further than I intended. And when I reached for the chair, when I let myself sit, I felt it, not fear, not regret, but something else entirely, something that felt a lot like the beginning of a story I was not sure I was ready to hear. And across from me, he did not smile, did not react, he simply nodded once, like this had always been the outcome he was waiting for, and I understood, too late to change it, that this was not a moment I had stepped into, it was one I had just agreed to continue. The moment I sat down, the room did not react loudly, it reacted quietly, which was worse, because quiet meant people noticed and chose not to show it, and that kind of attention lingers longer. I could feel it in the subtle shifts around us, conversations lowering just enough, glances lingering half a second too long before looking away, like everyone understood that something had crossed a line even if no one said it out loud. And I was suddenly very aware of where I was sitting, not at the edge of the room anymore, not moving between tables, but right here, beside him. Inside a space that had never been meant for someone like me. I kept my hands still on my lap, because I did not trust them not to give me away, not the nerves, not the awareness, not the fact that this felt like stepping into a version of my life I had already decided was not mine. Comfortable, he asked, and the question was simple, almost polite, but it carried something underneath it, something that made it clear he was not asking about the chair. No, I said honestly, because pretending would have been useless, and something in his expression shifted again, not surprised, not offended, just acknowledged, like honesty was the only currency he actually respected. Good, he replied, and that single word settled between us in a way that made my pulse slow instead of race, because it meant discomfort was not a problem to him. It was expected, maybe even necessary, and that realization made me sit a little straighter, not in submission, but in awareness. Because if this was something he was used to, then I needed to understand why. Why me? I asked. Before I could stop myself, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the weight of them, not as a mistake, but as a shift, because questions change the balance of a conversation. They demand answers, they refuse to simply follow. And for the first time since this started, I was not reacting to him. I was asking him to explain himself, and that mattered more than I expected. He did not answer immediately, which somehow made the question feel heavier, like he was deciding how much truth I was allowed to hear, or maybe how much I could handle. His fingers rested lightly against the table, not tense, not restless, just still, controlled in a way that made every movement seem intentional. Because you did not ask for permission, he said finally, and the answer caught me off guard. Not because it was complicated, but because it was not. It was direct, stripped of anything unnecessary, and I did not know what to do with that kind of clarity. To sing. I clarified, because that felt like the obvious interpretation, the safe one. But he shook his head slightly, just once. To exist, he corrected, and that hit differently, deeper, because it was not about the performance, not about the aria, not about the moment everyone else saw. It was about something quieter, something that had nothing to do with the room and everything to do with me. And I did not like how accurate it felt, how it reached into a part of me I had spent years trying to ignore, because existing without asking for permission sounds simple until you realize how often you have been doing the opposite, adjusting, shrinking, fitting into spaces that were easier, safer, expected. That is not true, I said. But the words lacked conviction, and he noticed. Of course he did. It is, he replied, not arguing, just stating, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he was not trying to convince me. He was simply telling me what he saw, and whether I accepted it or not did not change that. I looked away for a second, not to avoid him, but to think, to create space in my own head, because this conversation was not going the way I expected. It was not about power or control, or even the strange promise he had made earlier. It was about something else. Entirely, something harder to define, harder to dismiss, and that made it more dangerous than anything obvious could have been. And what do you want from me? I asked, quieter now, because this felt like the real question, not the one about the song or the offer, but the one underneath all of it, the one that determined what this would become. He held my gaze for a long second, longer than was comfortable, longer than was necessary, like he was measuring the weight of the answer before giving it. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, not softer, just more focused. Nothing you do not choose, he said. And the words should have been reassuring. They should have felt like freedom, but instead they unsettled me more than anything else he had said. Because choice means responsibility, it means ownership, it means whatever happens next is not something I can blame on him or the situation or the moment. It means it is mine, and I was not sure I was ready for that. Not with him, not with this. That sounds like a trap, I said, because it felt like one, even if I could not explain why. And for the first time since I sat down, he almost smiled, not fully, not openly, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, like he appreciated the honesty even if he did not agree with it. It is not a trap, he said. It is an invitation. And there it was again, that word, invitation, not command, not demand, something that could be accepted or refused, but only if I was willing to decide. And I realized, sitting there with the weight of his attention and the quiet hum of the room around us, that this was not about being pulled into his world. It was about being offered a door and asked if I would walk through it on my own. And the most unsettling part was not that the door was there. It was that I was no longer sure I wanted to walk away from it. The word invitation stayed with me longer than it should have, longer than made sense, because invitations are supposed to be simple, yes or no, in or out. But this did not feel simple. It felt like standing on the edge of something I could not fully see. And the worst part was not the uncertainty. It was the fact that a part of me was leaning forward instead of stepping back. You make it sound easy, I said, because I needed to break the weight of it, to bring it back down to something I could understand, something I could control. But he shook his head slightly, not dismissing me, just correcting. It is not easy, he said. It is clear. And that distinction mattered more than I expected, because clarity removes excuses. It strips away the comfort of pretending you do not know what you are doing. And I felt that settle somewhere deep, uncomfortable and undeniable. I looked down at my hands for a second, steady now, no longer trembling, and that should have reassured me, but it did not, because steadiness meant I was not acting on impulse anymore. It meant I was aware, and awareness makes every choice heavier. And if I say no? I asked, lifting my gaze back to his, because I needed to know, needed to hear it out loud, needed to understand what walking away actually meant in a situation like this. He did not hesitate, did not pause. Then you leave, he said, simple, direct, final, and for a second I just stared at him, waiting for something else, some hidden condition, some unspoken consequence. But there was nothing, just that, and it should have made everything easier. It should have given me a clear exit, but instead it made the decision harder, because there was no pressure to push against, no force to resist, just a door that would remain open or closed depending entirely on me. And I realized that was the real weight of it, not his world, not his power, but the fact that he was not taking my choice away, he was handing it back to me, and I was not sure I remembered how to carry it. And if I say yes, I continued, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid, but because this felt like the kind of question that changes things, the kind that does not get asked lightly. And when he answered, his tone shifted just slightly, not softer, not warmer, just more deliberate, like each word mattered. Then you stop pretending this is all you are, he said, and the words landed harder than anything else he had said so far, because they were not about him, not about his world or his offer or the strange promise that started all of this. They were about me, about the version of myself I had been holding on to like it was the only safe option, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not from fear, but from recognition, because pretending had been easier, smaller, safer, and he was asking me to step out of that, not by force, but by choice. And that was infinitely more terrifying. I let out a slow breath, not realizing I had been holding it, and looked around the room for the first time since I sat down. Really looked, not as a waitress scanning for empty glasses or impatient guests, but as someone standing in the middle of a space that no longer felt entirely foreign. The lights were still too bright, the conversation still too polished, the distance between people still measured in more than just physical space, but it did not feel as unreachable as it had before, and that realization unsettled me, because it meant the line I had always believed was fixed was not as solid as I thought. You assume I want more, I said, because that felt like the last defense I had, the last way to hold on to the life I understood, to define my limits before they could be redefined for me. And for a moment, just a brief one, something almost like patience crossed his expression, not condescending, not dismissive, just waiting. I do not assume, he said, I observe. And the way he said it made it clear he was not guessing. He was drawing conclusions from what he had already seen. And that made it harder to argue, harder to dismiss, because I knew, somewhere, beneath the resistance, that he was not entirely wrong, that there was a part of me that had not been satisfied with just surviving, that had not fully let go of what it meant to want something more, even if I had convinced myself otherwise. And what if you are wrong? I asked, because I needed to push back, needed to test the certainty he carried so easily, needed to find a place where it cracked, but he did not flinch, did not reconsider. Then you lose nothing, he said, and the simplicity of that answer made it difficult to argue, because it removed the risk I had been building in my mind, the idea that stepping forward would cost me everything I had worked to hold together, and in its place, it left something much harder to face, the possibility that I had more to gain than I was willing to admit. I sat there for a long second, the noise of the room returning in pieces, the music blending back into the background, the world continuing around us as if nothing had shifted, even though everything had. And I realized that this moment, right here, was not about him anymore. Not really. It was about me, about whether I would stay where I was because it was safe or step forward because it was true. And the answer did not come all at once. It did not arrive in a dramatic realization or a sudden decision. It came quietly, in the way my hands no longer felt like they belonged to someone smaller, in the way my voice had not shaken when I spoke, in the way I had not stood up and walked away the moment I had the chance. And when I finally looked back at him, really looked, not as someone trying to resist, but as someone deciding, I understood something I had not been ready to admit before, that the most dangerous part of this was not him. It was the fact that I was starting to want to say yes. Wanting something is easy when it stays in your head, quiet, contained, hypothetical. But the moment you say it out loud, the moment you let it exist in the open, it becomes real, and real things have consequences. I could feel that line approaching, that invisible edge where thinking turns into choosing. And for the first time since I sat down, I understood that there was no version of this where I stayed exactly the same. Not if I walked away, and definitely not if I stayed. You are very sure of yourself, I said, because it felt like the safest way to slow things down, to shift the focus away from the decision building inside me and back onto something I could question, something I could challenge. But he did not take it as a challenge. He did not defend himself or deny it. He simply nodded once. "I am sure of what I see," he replied, and that answer landed differently. Not arrogance, not ego, just certainty rooted in observation, and I realized that arguing with that would not change anything, because he was not trying to convince me. He was simply stating what he believed to be true, and whether I accepted it or not did not alter his perspective. "And what exactly do you see?" I asked, because if he was going to define me so easily, then I needed to hear it, needed to understand the version of me that existed in his mind, the one he seemed so certain about. He leaned back slightly, not creating distance, just adjusting, like he was giving the question the space it deserved. "Someone who has already decided she wants more," he said, and the words were quiet, almost matter of fact, but they hit with a weight that made my chest tighten, because they did not feel like a guess. They felt like a reflection, like he was holding up a version of me I had been avoiding, and I wanted to deny it, wanted to push it away, wanted to reduce it to something smaller, something easier to dismiss. But the truth is, denial only works when you do not recognize yourself in what is being said, and I did, more than I wanted to admit. "Wanting is not the same as choosing," I said, and this time my voice was firm, not defensive, just clear, because that distinction mattered. It was the difference between possibility and action, between safety and risk, and I needed him to understand that I was not someone who moved blindly into something just because it felt right in the moment. He watched me for a second, longer than necessary, like he was measuring the difference between the words and the intention behind them. And then he nodded slightly. "No," he agreed. "It is not." And there was no argument in his tone, just acknowledgement, which surprised me more than resistance would have, because agreement meant he was not trying to push me. He was letting me arrive at the conclusion on my own, and that made the silence that followed heavier, not empty, but full of everything neither of us was saying. I looked down at the table for a moment, at the polished surface, reflecting fragments of light, distorted but still recognizable, and I realized that was exactly what this felt like, seeing a version of myself that was familiar but altered, clearer in some places, harder to ignore in others. "Then why do you act like the decision is already made?" I asked, because that was the part one could not reconcile, the certainty in his tone, the way he spoke as if this was inevitable, as if my choice was just a formality, and that unsettled me more than anything else. Because inevitability removes control, and I was not ready to give that up, not to him, not to anyone. He did not answer immediately, which told me the question mattered, that it was not something he dismissed or overlooked, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate, like each word was placed with intention. "Because you are still sitting here," he said, and the simplicity of that answer made everything else fall away, because it was true, painfully, undeniably true. I had been given an exit, a clear one, no consequences, no pressure, no expectation, and I had not taken it. I was still here, still engaged, still asking questions instead of walking away, and that said more than any declaration ever could. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to explain, but the words did not come, because there was no argument that did not contradict what I had already done, and for the first time that night, I felt it fully, not just the tension or the uncertainty, but the shift, the moment where something internal changes in a way that cannot be undone, not because of him, not because of the room or the situation, but because of me, because of the choices I had already made without fully acknowledging them. And that realization was both grounding and terrifying at the same time, because it meant this was not something happening to me. It was something I was stepping into, piece by piece, choice by choice. "You are right about one thing," I said finally, my voice quieter now, not from hesitation, but from clarity, and he watched me, not interrupting, not reacting, just present in a way that made it easier to continue. "I am still here," I added, and that felt like the first honest statement I had made since this conversation began. Not defensive, not reactive, just true. And for a second, something in his expression shifted, not satisfaction, not victory, just recognition, like he understood exactly what that meant without needing me to explain it. And that was when I realized something else, something I had not considered before, that this was not about him convincing me. It was about me admitting something to myself, something I had already started to accept but had not said out loud until now. And as the room continued around us, as the music played and the conversations resumed, and the night moved forward like nothing had changed, I understood that for me, everything already had, because staying was no longer accidental, it was intentional, and that made whatever came next entirely my responsibility. There is a difference between realizing something and accepting it, and I was standing exactly in that space, the narrow, uncomfortable distance between knowing I had already made a choice and admitting what that choice meant. The room had returned to its rhythm. The orchestra's steady now, conversations flowing again, but for me everything felt slightly altered, like the tempo had changed and I was the only one who could hear it. So what happens now? I asked, and this time the question was not defensive, not a way to stall or redirect. It was genuine, because if I was going to stay, if I was going to continue this moment instead of walking away from it, then I needed to understand where it was leading, or at least where he intended it to lead. He did not answer immediately, which I was starting to realize was deliberate, not hesitation, but consideration, like he treated words as something that should only be used when necessary. That depends on you, he said finally, and there it was again, that same return of choice, that same refusal to define things for me. And I felt a flicker of frustration, not because he was wrong, but because he was consistent, because he would not give me something to push against, something to resist, something to blame. You keep saying that, I replied, and this time there was a trace of something sharper in my voice, not anger, but pressure, the kind that comes from wanting clarity and not receiving it in the way you expect, because it is the only part that matters, he said, and the calm in his tone made it difficult to argue, because he was not trying to win the conversation, he was simply stating his position, and I realized that was the pattern. He did not force, he did not persuade, he observed, and then waited, and that waiting was what made this feel different from anything I had experienced before, because it placed the weight exactly where I had been avoiding it, on me. Then let me be clear, I said, straightening slightly, not in defiance, but in decision, because if this was about choice, then I needed to start acting like I understood that. I am not someone who can just step into your world because of one night. And the words felt solid as they left me, grounded, intentional, something I could stand on. He listened without interrupting, his attention steady, not challenging, not dismissive, just present, which made it easier to continue. I have a life, I added, and it may not look like this, but it is mine. And that felt important to say, not because I thought he did not know it, but because I needed to hear it out loud, needed to remind myself that what I had built, even if it was small, even if it was quiet, still mattered. He nodded once, slow, acknowledging. I know, he said, and there was no contradiction in his voice, no attempt to minimize what I had just said, which surprised me, because I had expected him to challenge it, to reframe it, to push me towards something bigger, but he did not. He simply accepted it, and that made the next thing he said land even more clearly. I am not asking you to leave it, he continued, and for a second I just stared at him, because that was not what I expected, not what I had prepared for, not what I had been building my resistance against. Then what are you asking? I asked, and this time my voice was quieter, not from uncertainty, but from focus, because this felt like the part that mattered, the part that defined everything else. He held my gaze, steady, unflinching, and when he spoke, there was no hesitation, no ambiguity, just clarity. I am asking you to stop limiting it, he said, and the words settled into the space between us with a weight that felt heavier than anything before, because they did not challenge my life, they challenged my perception of it, and that was harder to defend, harder to argue, harder to dismiss. I let the silence stretch for a moment, not because I did not have a response, but because I needed to understand what that meant, not in his terms, but in mine, because if I was going to respond, it needed to come from somewhere real, not reactive, not defensive, but intentional. You make it sound simple, I said finally, and there was no sarcasm in it, just honesty, because from where I was sitting, nothing about this felt simple, not the choice, not the implications, not the way this conversation had already shifted something I had spent years keeping contained. He did not smile, did not dismiss it. It is not simple, he said, echoing what he had said before, but it is possible. And that word lingered, possible, because possibility is dangerous in its own way. It creates space where there was none. It introduces alternatives where there was certainty. And I had built my life on certainty, on predictability, on knowing exactly what came next. And now that foundation felt less solid, not because it was gone, but because there was something else beside it, something I had not allowed myself to consider before. I leaned back slightly, not retreating, just creating a small distance, enough to think, enough to feel the weight of the moment without being pulled entirely into it. And as I looked at him, really looked, not as a figure of power or a disruption to my night, but as someone offering something I had not expected, I realized that this was not about changing my life in a single moment. It was about whether I was willing to admit that it could be different, and that realization settled in slowly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like a note held long enough to become part of the silence around it. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel the need to argue, not because I agreed with everything he was saying, but because I understood the question he was really asking, and more importantly, I understood that the answer was not something he could give me. It was something I had to decide for myself. And as the music played on and the room continued to move around us, I realized that this moment, this conversation, was no longer about whether I would walk away or stay. It was about whether I was ready to see myself differently than I had before, and that was a decision I could not pretend to avoid any longer. The hardest part about seeing yourself differently is not the change itself. It is what you have to admit about who you were before. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet certainty in his voice, I realized that this was not just about possibility. It was about honesty, the kind that strips away every excuse you have been using to stay exactly where you are. And for a long moment, I did not speak, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I needed to understand what I was about to admit, because once it was said out loud, once it existed outside of my thoughts, there would be no pretending I had not already crossed that line. "You think I am limiting myself?" I said finally, and this time it was not a question, it was a statement, something I was testing not just against him, but against myself. He did not answer immediately, which I had come to expect, but when he did, his tone was steady, grounded, like he was not trying to persuade me, only to reflect something back to me. "I think you chose safety over truth," he said, and the words did not feel like an attack. They felt like a recognition, and that made them harder to dismiss, because I could feel the truth in them, not entirely, not completely, but enough that I could not ignore it, enough that it settled somewhere deep and uncomfortable. I looked away for a second, not to escape, but to think, because if I responded too quickly, it would not be honest, it would just be reaction, and I was starting to understand that honesty mattered more in this conversation than anything else. "Safety is not a weakness," I said, and I meant it, because it was not. It was what had kept me stable, what had kept my life from unraveling when things had not gone the way I planned. It was what allowed me to move forward without constantly looking back, and for a moment, I needed to hold on to that, needed to remind myself that choosing stability was not something to be ashamed of. He nodded slightly, acknowledging, "No," he agreed. "But it is not supposed to be permanent." And that was the part one had not been ready to face. The idea that what had started as protection had quietly become limitation, that something I had relied on had also been holding me in place. And I felt that realization shift something inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that I could not pretend it was not there. "You make it sound like I gave up," I said, because that was what it felt like he was implying, and that was harder to accept than anything else, harder than the idea of change, harder than the possibility he was offering, because giving up meant failure, and I had spent too long convincing myself that I had simply chosen a different path, not that I had abandoned one. But he shook his head slightly, just once. "No," he said, "I think you paused." And that word landed differently, softer, but somehow more precise. Because pausing is not the same as ending. It is not final. It is not permanent. It is something that can be undone, something that can be continued. And I felt that settle in a way I had not expected, because it shifted the narrative I had been telling myself for years, from something finished to something interrupted. And that was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Because if it was only a pause, then it meant I still had a choice, and choices come with responsibility. "And you think I should just continue?" I said, and there was a hint of hesitation in my voice now, not from doubt, but from the weight of what that would actually mean. Because continuing was not as simple as stepping back onto a stage. It was rebuilding something I had intentionally stepped away from. It was facing everything I had chosen not to deal with. It was risking failure again in a way that felt very real, very immediate. He watched me for a moment, not rushing, not pushing, just present. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate, like he understood exactly what that question carried. "I think you should decide if it is still yours," he said. And that was different. Not an instruction, not a direction, just a question reframed. One that placed the focus entirely back on me, on what I wanted, not what he thought, not what was possible, but what actually belonged to me. And I realized that was the part one had been avoiding, not the difficulty, not the risk, but the ownership. Because if it was still mine, then I had to choose what to do with it. And if it was not, then I had to accept that too, without excuses, without deflection, just honestly. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of that settle, letting the noise of the room fade just enough that I could actually hear my own thoughts. Because for the first time since this conversation started, I was not thinking about him or what he represented. I was thinking about myself, about what I had left behind and why, about whether that reason still held, about whether the version of me that walked away was the same version sitting here now. And the answer did not come immediately. It did not arrive in a clear, simple statement. It came in pieces, in memories I had not revisited in a long time, in feelings I had chosen not to examine too closely, in the quiet realization that maybe I had not stopped because I wanted to, but because I thought I had to, and that difference mattered more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. I looked back at him then, not searching for an answer, not asking for guidance, just acknowledging that this conversation had brought me to a place I had been avoiding. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing to add, nothing to push, just the understanding that something had shifted, not in the room, not in the night, but in me. And as I sat there, aware of that shift in a way I could not ignore, I realized that whatever came next would not be about proving anything to him or anyone else. It would be about deciding whether I was ready to be honest with myself. And that was a question I could not walk away from anymore. There are moments when the world does not change around you, but something inside you does, quiet, almost invisible, until you realize you cannot return to the version of yourself that existed before it. And as I sat there, with his words still settling in the spaces I had carefully avoided for years, I understood that this was one of those moments, not because he had forced anything, not because he had convinced me of something I did not already feel, but because he had asked the one question I could not ignore, whether it was still mine, and I had not answered, not yet, but the silence itself felt like an answer in progress. "You are very patient," I said after a while, because it was the only thing I could name with certainty. The way he did not interrupt, did not rush, did not try to fill the space with anything unnecessary, and that patience felt deliberate, like he understood that whatever I was working through could not be pushed, only allowed. He gave a small nod, not dismissing the observation, just accepting it. "Some decisions lose their value if they are rushed," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made it feel less like a general statement and more like something personal, something he had learned. And for a second, I wondered what that meant for him, what kind of choices he had made, what kind of consequences he had learned to live with. But I did not ask, because this moment was not about him. Not really. It was about me, about whether I was willing to step into something I had spent years stepping away from. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of that settle, not pressing, not overwhelming, just present, like a note held long enough to become part of the silence. "I used to think I had to choose between being practical and being more," I said, and the words felt unfamiliar as they left me, not because they were untrue, but because I had not said them out loud in a long time. If ever, he did not interrupt, did not react, just listened, and that made it easier to continue. "And I chose practical," I added, because that was the simplest way to explain it, the cleanest version of a much more complicated decision. The version I had told myself often enough that it felt like fact instead of interpretation. "And was it the right choice?" he asked, and the question was not sharp, not challenging, just open, like he was genuinely asking, not testing. And that made it harder to answer, because honesty requires more than just repeating what you have already decided to believe. It requires examining whether that belief still holds. I thought about it for a moment, not long, but long enough to feel the difference between instinct and truth. It was the safe choice, I said finally, and even as I said it, I knew that was not the same thing. Not really. Safety and rightness are not always aligned, and I could feel that distinction more clearly now than I ever had before. He nodded slightly, acknowledging, but did not push further, did not add anything to it. And that silence gave me space to think, to actually consider the question instead of just answering it. And as I did, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that I could feel it, like a door I had closed a long time ago was no longer as firmly shut as I thought. I do not know if it is still the right choice, I admitted, and that felt like the most honest thing I had said all night. Not a conclusion, not a decision, just an acknowledgement that what had once made sense might not make sense anymore. And that realization was both unsettling and freeing at the same time, because it meant I was no longer bound to a decision I had made under different circumstances, with a different understanding of myself. He watched me for a moment, not reacting, not evaluating, just present. And then he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost like he was careful not to disrupt what I was realizing. Then maybe the question is not what you chose before, he said, but what you are choosing now. And that reframing settled into place immediately, because it shifted the focus away from the past, away from what I had done or why, and placed it entirely in the present, in this moment, in this decision. And I realized that was what had been missing, not the courage, not the opportunity, but the willingness to see myself as someone who still had a choice, not someone defined by what she had already decided. I sat with that for a second, letting it settle, letting it take shape in a way that felt real, not theoretical, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was being pulled in two directions. I felt like I was standing in one place, looking forward, not back, and that difference mattered more than I expected. And if I choose differently, I said, not looking away from him, not avoiding the weight of it, but also not fully stepping into it yet, just acknowledging the possibility. He did not answer right away, but when he did, his voice carried that same steady certainty, not forceful, not demanding, just clear. Then you stop being someone who almost lived her life, he said, and the words settled into something deeper than I was prepared for, because they did not sound like a promise. They sounded like a truth, one that I could either accept or ignore, but not dismiss. And I felt that land in a way that was impossible to pretend I did not understand, because somewhere beneath everything else, beneath the hesitation and the caution and the need to protect what I had built, there was something else, something quieter but more persistent, the awareness that I had been standing at the edge of something for a long time. And tonight, for the first time, I had actually stepped forward, and as I sat there, feeling the weight of that step, I realized that whatever came next was not about proving anything, not to him, not to anyone else. It was about whether I was ready to stop standing at the edge and actually move. The moment you decide to move forward is rarely loud. It does not come with a dramatic declaration or a clear turning point. It comes quietly, in the way something inside you settles instead of resists. And as I sat there, listening to the echo of his words in a space that suddenly felt too clear to ignore, I realized that I had already crossed the line I was so carefully trying to stand behind. Not when I sang, not when I sat down, but when I stopped pretending that I did not understand what this moment was asking of me. And for the first time that night, I did not feel pulled in different directions. I felt still, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped avoiding the question. I am not ready to give you an answer, I said, and the words felt steady, grounded, not defensive, not uncertain, just honest, because readiness is not something you can force. It either exists or it does not, and pretending otherwise would only bring me back to the same place I had been trying to leave. He did not react with disappointment, did not push, did not try to change my mind. He simply nodded once, like this was exactly what he expected, and that lack of pressure made the moment feel more real, not less. You do not have to be, he said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he was not withdrawing the invitation, just acknowledging the pace at which it would unfold. And that mattered more than I thought it would, because it meant this was not about urgency. It was about intention. I let that settle, letting the quiet between us hold the weight of what had already been said. And for a second, I allowed myself to simply exist in it, without trying to resolve it, without trying to define it, just acknowledging that something had changed and that change would not disappear just because I chose not to act on it immediately. But I am not saying no, I added, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no need to soften it or explain it, because it was the closest thing to clarity I had reached, not a decision, not a commitment, but a direction, and when I looked at him, I saw it. Not surprise, not satisfaction, just recognition. Like he understood exactly what that meant without needing me to elaborate. "I know," he said, and those two words carried a quiet certainty that felt less like assumption and more like acknowledgement. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel the need to challenge it, because it aligned with something I was starting to understand myself. The room around us had continued as if nothing had changed, the music steady, the conversations flowing, the night moving forward in its polished, predictable rhythm. But for me, everything felt slightly different. Not because my life had suddenly shifted, not because I had made some irreversible choice, but because I had allowed myself to see that it could, and that awareness was something I could not undo. No matter how much I tried to return to what was familiar, I stood slowly, not abruptly, not as an escape, but as a continuation, because staying seated was no longer necessary to hold this moment. It had already taken root, and I could carry it with me. "I have to finish my shift," I said, and this time it did not feel like a retreat. It felt like a boundary, a choice. To return to something that still mattered while acknowledging that something else had begun. He nodded again, not stopping me, not asking me to stay, just accepting the movement as part of the process, and that made it easier to take the step, easier to stand without feeling like I was walking away from something unfinished, because this was not finished, not even close. It was just beginning. I reached for the tray, my hands steady, not because the tension was gone, but because I understood it now, understood where it came from and what it meant, and as I turned to leave, I felt it again, that quiet awareness of his presence, not holding me back, not pulling me forward, just there, like a note that had not faded, and I knew, without needing to look back, that this would not end when I walked away from the table. It would follow me, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as possibility. And as I moved through the room, returning to the rhythm I had known for so long, something felt different, not in what I was doing, but in how I was doing it. Like I was no longer just passing through this space. I was aware of it, aware of myself within it. And that awareness carried a quiet strength I had not felt in a long time. And as the night continued, as the music played and the lights reflected off polished surfaces and conversations rose and fell around me, I realized that this was not the end of a story. It was the moment it began, not with a decision, not with a declaration, but with a question I was finally willing to answer. Not tonight, not all at once, but soon. And when I did, it would not be because someone had asked me to. It would be because I had finally chosen it for myself.